early for legislative work, which today will include temporary extension of federal aviation programs and also instructing conferees in their conference, their work with the Senate on payroll tax cut extension. House Republican leaders have announced that they are adding to the schedule tomorrow legislation by Arizona Democrat Representative Gabrielle Giffords, a border security bill. That's tomorrow in the House. She's expected to be in the House this evening for the State of the Union. Our coverage tonight gets underway at 8 with the President's speech expected around 9 o'clock. All of that here on C-SPAN. Now to the House floor here on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. Prayer will be offered today by our guest chaplain, Dr. Kate Braestrup, Maine Warden Service, Lincolnville, Maine.
St. Francis of Assisi advises us to pray constantly. If necessary, he says, use words. Join me in a spirit of prayer. God, our prayer today arises from a house of words, from a nation rooted in words. We do not derive our identity as Americans from our color or our creed from our wealth or power, nor even from the land itself, though we do love the land. Rather, by your grace, America is America through its words, that all men are created equal, that all are endowed with inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These beautiful, necessary words. God, may every word spoken and written from this chamber contain an echo of those words. May our words, too, be necessary and true. May our words remember and inspire the brave, compassionate action that is and always has been America's finest prayer. Amen. Thank you.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Hayworth.
Would everyone join me, please, in putting your hand over your heart? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Without objection, the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Michaud, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my honor today to welcome Reverend Kate Braystrup to the House of Representatives. In 1996, Kate's husband, Maine State Police Trooper James Drew Griffith, was tragically killed in a car accident while on duty. At the time of his death, Drew was beginning to prepare to become a Universalist Unitarian minister. Kate decided to pursue Drew's dream and began attending the Bangor Theological Seminary in 1997. She was ordained in 2004. Since 2001, Kate has served as the chaplain for the Maine Warden Service, providing counsel for the families of loved ones lost in Maine's wilderness. An accomplished writer and minister, Kate has authored several books, including the national bestseller, Here If You Need Me. Kate is a true asset to our state. Her remarkable devotion to helping others has made her an invaluable public servant and a beloved member of the community. It is my honor to welcome Reverend Braystrup to the House. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair will entertain up to 15 further requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. What purpose does the gentlewoman from New York rise? Does the gentlewoman seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last November, I hosted a jobs fair in New York's Hudson Valley. 1,000 local residents came to meet with nearly 40 local employers, all seeking work, of course, all offering work. At Christmas, I was very happy to receive a card from one of our residents. She had found a job at our jobs fair. So the question I have as we approach the President's State of the Union tonight is, how can we multiply this story by 14 million? And I think we can do it if we work together, House and Senate and President, to free American enterprise to create jobs. Washington cannot regulate or tax us into growth, but we can work together to lift burdens and bring the federal government to the right size to serve and not to suffocate a strong and healthy economy. I stand ready to work with our colleagues to pursue this simple common sense, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise? Without objection.
One of the biggest stumbling blocks to America's economic recovery is that corporations can legally buy elections and then influence policies which move millions of jobs out of America, which escape taxation by offshoring profits, which cash in on wars, which press military-industrial spending through the roof. While we pledge allegiance to the red, white, and blue, corporations whose only allegiance is to green are selling out America. And they're becoming ever more powerful because of a Supreme Court decision in Citizens United, which effectively turns this government into an auction where policies may go to the highest bidder. We must stand up for America. We must reclaim our nation. House Joint Resolution 100 is a constitutional amendment which aims at taking all private money out of elections and returning government to the people. I urge my colleagues to support H.Res 100. So that we can break the golden shackles which are imprisoning this government right now and get rid of corporate influence once and for all. No private money in elections. Support H.Res 100. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Alabama rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have now reached 1,000 days since the Congress of the United States has adopted a budget. It's not the fault of the House of Representatives. We've passed a budget, passed one last year, going to pass one again this year. The President has proposed a budget every year, and nobody here much liked it. That's okay. He at least proposed a budget. What we haven't seen is the other body at the other end of the Capitol adopt a budget at all. They don't like the House budget, they don't like the President's budget, and they don't do anything. The fact is, if we're ever going to get our financial house in order, we have to have a budget, just like families, just like businesses, and it's time for the other body to pass a budget. It's time for the President to call on the other body, which is controlled by his party, to pass a budget. I hope he'll do that tonight, because the fact is, we've got to get this country working again. It's all about jobs, and the fact that the Congress can't operate under a budget, control its and get its fiscal house in order is hindering that job growth because it's affecting the financial markets in a negative way. So to the other body, pass a budget.
Gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from California rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it's been more than a year since the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives. What do the American people have to show for it? We still have not passed a single bill to create jobs. We've had a vote to end Medicare as we know it. And we've had a vote to slash college funds, aids for the American young people. 14 million Americans are without jobs. Families are hurting, and they need our help. Let's get to work now on extending the payroll tax cut and unemployment benefits for a full year. Many of my constituents rely on unemployment benefits to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. I urge the Conference Committee to get started and work on it today. Forget about the tax break for millionaires and billionaires and companies that ship jobs overseas. Let's create jobs. Let's create jobs and help the middle class and extend the payroll tax and unemployment benefits today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revised.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it was April 29, 2009, 1,000 days ago, when the Democrat-controlled Senate last passed a budget. Back then, Solyndra was not a household name. General Motors was not yet bankrupt. Billy Mays was still selling OxyClean. And my good friend Tebow from Gainesville, no one knew about Tebow time. Since then, the federal government has added $4.1 trillion to the national debt. Our fiscal situation is in shambles. Entitlement spending is growing while defense spending is being cut, and the policies of a bigger and bigger government and higher taxes have not been successful. When the Senate last passed a budget, CBO predicted that the deficit for 2011 would be $693 billion. Today it's $1.3 trillion. A budget is the first and most basic step that must be taken towards reining in historically high levels of spending and massive government growth. It is time for the Senate to do their job.
Gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise? New York.
Mr.
Gentleman is
Speaker,
recognized for 1 minute.
I bring to this House and the nation great news from Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo. Roswell Park is the first comprehensive cancer institute in the entire nation. Today they are launching a clinical trial to test the use of a cancer vaccine as therapy to kill cancer cells and to prevent a relapse of the disease. The vaccine is designed to boost the body's immune system to fight and destroy cancer cells. The vaccine has shown early promise in treating ovarian, bladder, brain, and breast cancer. The vaccine's exciting potential is a direct result of many years of cancer research. For cancer research to be effective, it has to be sustained over the longer term. It can't stop and start because you lose promising research and promising researchers. So my message to Congress today is that the only failure in cancer research is when you quit or you're forced to quit because of a lack of funding. I urge my colleagues to fully fund cancer research in the 2012 budget, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. What purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is day 1,000. 1,000 days since the Senate Democrats last passed a budget. To put that in perspective, I asked my Twitter followers, my Facebook friends to tell me what they've done in the last 1,000 days. I'd like to share some of the comments. One says that between my home and my small business, over 60 monthly budgets have been taken care of, and they are getting harder and harder to balance. Another said, cut our family debt by $60,000 in 1 year, removed 2 car payments, and finished my bachelor degree while working full-time, being a father, and getting ready for a business launch. Another said, finished 75 college credits, watched over 100 films, directed 16 hours of TV, and tutored over 1,000 hours. Final one. My son made 1 overseas deployment, started his second one, finished his master's degree at Georgia Tech since the last budget. Mr. Speaker, one thing is very clear. The American people are working hard. The House of Representatives, we are working hard with 27 jobs bills and counting passed. The only question, Mr. Speaker, is when will the Senate join us? Thank you.
Time has expired. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to address the importance of setting our priorities as a Congress. It seems that some of my colleagues have lost sight of what is important. We should be focused on putting teachers, firefighters, and construction workers back to work, creating jobs by investing in infrastructure and improving America's schools, giving the middle class a tax cut, putting money in the pockets of consumers, helping small businesses thrive and grow, keeping Americans in their homes, committing to our veterans and making sure they can get jobs when they return from duty, protecting Social Security and Medicare, and making sure we are investing in this great nation so our children have an opportunity to get ahead. It's time we take a step back and reevaluate our priorities. The American people deserve it. I yield back.
The woman yields back her time. What purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to support National School Choice Week. School choice means empowering families to make the best decision for their students and helping them learn in an environment that best suits their child's needs and interests. We must work to ensure that every student has access to quality public education, but some families may choose alternatives like charter schools, private schools, or homeschools. State and local government, as well as the federal government, should do their part to pass legislation making it easier for students to choose the school that best suits them. My wife and I have tried to choose the schooling that is best for our children, and I trust that our decision will help them have the best education possible. I want all families and all students to have that same opportunity, choosing the education forum that best suits their students. I yield back.
Goes back his time. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For every single job that is created, there are 4 people waiting for that job. So I rise today, Mr. Speaker, to voice my support for a year-long extension of the payroll tax cut for middle-class Americans. Unfortunately, my Republican colleagues tried until the very last minute to raise taxes on the middle class just before the holidays. But the American people spoke up and let the Congress know that they would not stand for it. We cannot wait for another last-minute fix. We need a year-long extension of the payroll taxes and unemployment insurance now. We cannot afford to take more risk with the incomes of more than 160 million Americans the way the Republicans did in 2011. Remember, we need to create jobs. There are 4 people for every 1 job there is. That means we need more jobs. That means we need to support the President's jobs bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. What purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm here today to speak about something that is nearly 3 years in the making. Some 1,000 days ago, in April of 2009, the Senate passed a budget. And that's the last time we've seen any attempt from them to set Washington's agenda and rein in the government spending. Without a budget, how can government set its priorities? Without priorities, how can American citizens have any confidence in how their tax dollars are being used? The short answer is they can't. With a $15 trillion debt, the United States faces its greatest fiscal challenge in history. Washington must find a way to get its finances in order while preserving programs for our seniors, protecting our services for future generations, and providing our economy with the certainty to create much-needed jobs in America. The House will soon pass a budget that does this, and I urge the President to call for action during tonight's State of the Union address. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Missouri rise? Without objection, the gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Saturday, January 28th at noon, Iraq War veterans will be honored by a Returning Heroes Parade in downtown St. Louis. This is significant not only because these war veterans deserve this welcome home, but because St. Louis is the first city in the nation to hold such an event. The organizers are simply called the January 28th Group, a grassroots organization which launched a social network campaign to raise awareness and money to stage the parade and a Veterans Resource event to follow. The January 28th Group is partnering with St. Louis-based veteran service organizations, including The Mission Continues, which works to help veterans transfer their military leadership skills to civilian life. They say Missouri is the show-me state, but this time the compassionate and patriotic people of St. Louis are showing the nation just how quickly you can mobilize to give back to those who have given so much to our nation. I salute you all and wish you success for the Returning Heroes Parade at noon this coming Saturday, January 28th in downtown St. Louis. I yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman asks unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does the gentleman ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
There are consequences of not having a budget. One of them is you don't make proper plans. How else can you explain the Obama administration going so long and crying so loudly, gee, we can't find $10 billion to cut, much less $100 billion. We're certainly not going to cut $1 trillion, even though we increased spending by $1 trillion. And we find out last week from the Obama OMB that there is $687 billion sitting in accounts that's been appropriated, it's unobligated, it's unspent, sitting there, and they're still demanding more and more money. America can't afford it. It's time to claw back the money before it's spent on other cylinders and give us a budget at the other end of the building. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Maine arise?
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk for a minute about some exciting developments in clean energy in my state of Maine. Last week, Energy Secretary Chu released a report detailing the enormous potential for tidal energy off of U.S. coasts. There is enough there to meet up to 1/3 of our needs, and he singled out Maine, saying, quote, "These resources can create new industries and new jobs in America." He's right, and we're proving it. The Ocean Renewable Power Company of Portland is building a tidal power project in Maine that, if all goes as planned, will start producing clean American-made electricity as early as this summer. Meanwhile, we're welcoming one of the biggest energy companies in the world to our state. Statoil from Norway is considering a pilot project of large-scale wind turbines that would produce clean electricity while floating out of view off our coast. Experts say up to 15,000 jobs can be created in my state by offshore wind, good-paying American jobs that will help us regain our energy independence. This is good news off our coast, Mr. Speaker, for Maine and our country. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the President will deliver the State of the Union tonight. I expect to hear his vision of an America built to last. Mr. Speaker, let's listen together. Let's remember together. We must remember how and why we are the greatest nation in the world. We must remember those American values that built this nation. We must remember how in building this nation the middle class emerged and how they are our backbone and how they are our foundation. Hard work, pride, and being a just and fair nation is what makes us great. Let us look to the past, remember its lessons to build the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois rise?
I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
The State of the Union address tonight is going to be very important, and I agree with President Obama that this is a make-or-break moment for the middle class and those trying to reach it. And what's at stake is the very survival of the basic American promise that if you work hard, you can do well enough to raise a family, own a home, and put a little bit away for retirement. We can either settle for a country where a shrinking number of people do really well while more Americans barely get by, or we can build a nation where everyone gets a fair shot, he says, everyone does their fair share, and everyone plays by the same rules. We found out today that, especially when it comes to taxes, that there really are different rules for the rich. Mitt Romney released his taxes. He paid $42 million in taxes over the last he made $42 million over the last 2 years and paid at about a 14.5% rate because most of his income is in capital gains. Well, look at the tax brackets. If you make $8,500 as a single person, you're in a 15% tax bracket. Is that fair? I don't think so. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend, Speaker.
Without objection, gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Too many of our fellow Americans are living on the edge today and have been for far too long. The last thing they need is another showdown at the not-okay corral. They need jobs, they need to save or go back to their homes, and for those who have been living in poverty or those who used to be in the middle class but are now struggling to survive below the poverty level, they need us to provide the opportunity to help them lift them and their families out of poverty and to a better quality of life. Our President is coming to us tonight to again offer us some opportunities to do all of these things and more, and to restore our country's economic health. So let's not put our fellow Americans through another cliffhanger on things that are important to their well-being. Let us pass the payroll and unemployment insurance extension, fix the Medicare payment issue without drama, and come together to work on the bipartisan measures that the President will ask us to pass for our people and our country. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. What purpose does the gentleman from Puerto Rico seek recognition?
I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, today I introduced legislation that would extend the SSI program to Puerto Rico, the United States Virgin Islands, and Guam. SSI provides cash assistance to blind, disabled, or elderly individuals who have limited or no income. Although SSI applies in the States, it does not apply in Puerto Rico, which instead receives a block grant to assist its most vulnerable residents. Of all the disparities that Puerto Rico faces because of its territory status, this is perhaps the most harmful. Puerto Rico's annual grant is about $35 million. By contrast, the nation's poorest state, with almost 1 million fewer residents, received over $740 million in SSI funding in 2010. While in the states, beneficiaries received about $500 each month, Puerto Rico residents received only $70. Residents of Puerto Rico are American citizens, but when it comes to SSI, their citizenship is second class. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota rise?
To seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I brought a friend to the floor with me today. As we all know, this is Elmo. This guy taught us our 1, 2, 3s, but he also taught us tolerance and understanding. For the past several years, he's been doing the same thing for children in the Palestinian territories because of the Sesame Street. Because of the Sesame Street in Palestine, Palestinian kids grow up with a positive role model, the same positive role models we did. But recently, Sesame Street has been off the air. Now, Palestinian kids are left watching Farfour. This is Farfour right here. He's a mouse who is the main character of a Hamas TV show. Instead of tolerance and understanding, Farfour promotes violence and anti-Semitism. This Congress approved funding for the Sesame Street in Palestine last year, but because of the position of certain individuals in Congress, that means the money's being held up. There's no Elmo, but there is Farfour trafficking and teaching extremism. I'm not the only one who wants Congress to release the funding. Even the Israeli government wants it released. Let's get good funding to the people of Palestine so that they can grow and strengthen their own society. Let the funding flow and give something for Farfour to compete with Elmo.
The gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentlelady from Texas rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Speaker, I rise today to welcome our colleague, Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, back home to this House, a place that she served ably and is serving ably today. To thank her for her courage and to thank her for accepting the challenge of what an American hero is. Many have called her that, for in the course of this enormous tragedy, she stood tall and still continues to do that today. I want to thank the medical professionals, the emergency medical professionals, and many in Houston, Texas, TIER, one of the best and renowned rehabilitation hospitals in the world. But most of all, as Congresswoman Giffords comes back, let us give as a gift, both on behalf of the American people and this Congress, that we can work together to improve the lives of all Americans. That would be, I believe, her challenge. That would be her call. And as she comes back today, serving the people of Arizona and serving the American people, we want to say thank you, Congresswoman, for your courage and for being a model for the American people and challenging us to do the best. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Connecticut rise? Without objection, the gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 9 hours, the President will stand on this podium behind me to deliver the State of the Union address. I remember the first time he did that, I sat in this chamber as one of our colleagues called the new President a liar. And that was not the low mark in the partisanship that has earned this institution its historically low approval ratings by the American public. We'll be sitting in bipartisan fashion today, and I guess that's good. But let's make it something more than symbolic. Let's think in our responses to this speech, what is in this speech that we can find common ground to get done? I have a suggestion. I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, Northern or Southern, rich or poor. You need roads, you need railways, you need a good electrical grid for your economy to flourish. We're going to invest the money in those things at some point to fix them, to be world beaters. Why not do it soon? Why not do it soon when it would help our economy and help millions of out-of-work Americans go to work with dignity?
improving our infrastructure is the way to improve our economy. Thank you. Now I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Recorded votes on postponed questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2070 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 249, H.R. 2070, a bill to direct the Secretary of the Interior to install in the area of the World War II Memorial in the District of Columbia a suitable plaque or an inscription with the words that President Franklin D. Roosevelt prayed with the nation on June 6, 1944, the morning of D-Day.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, and the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablon, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I do myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in support for legislation that I sponsored, the World War II Memorial Prayer Act of 2011. This legislation directs the Secretary of Interior to install at the World War II Memorial a suitable plaque or an inscription with the words that President Franklin Roosevelt prayed with the nation on the morning of the D-Day invasion. This prayer, which has been entitled, "Let Our Hearts Be Stout," gave solace, comfort, and strength to our nation and our brave warriors as we fought against tyranny and oppression. The memorial was built to honor the 16 million who served in the armed forces of the United States during World War II and the more than 400,000 who died during the war. Prior to introducing the legislation, I spoke to many World War II veterans in Ohio and asked them if they thought putting the prayer on the memorial would be appropriate. The answer was a resounding yes. Furthermore, the nation's largest service organization, the American Legion, is supportive of this legislation. The American Legion, in a support letter, said that this legislation would bolster the meaning of the memorial and would also give strength and encouragement to future generations. It seems to me that if the remaining veterans of World War II are supportive of the prayer being added, we as a country should honor that request. Unfortunately, the administration and the Department of Interior don't think it's that easy. Last year, the Department of Interior testified before the Natural Resources Committee that this legislation would necessarily dilute the central message of the memorial. Now, I don't know how the administration came to this position, because I don't see how a non-denominational prayer that gave solace and comfort and strength to our nation during one of the most pivotal days of World War II and one of the most memorable days in our nation's history would dilute the central message of the memorial. In fact, I think it would do exactly the opposite and would only strengthen the central message of the memorial. To his credit, Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar testified during a hearing last year that he personally disagreed with his own department's testimony on the legislation. However, since his testimony, neither the Department of Interior nor the administration has changed their official position on this legislation. I am hopeful that after a bipartisan vote today on this legislation that the administration may have a change of heart. Fortunately, you don't have to just take my word for it, because today we are honored to be joined by George Poppy Fowler of Coolville, Ohio. Poppy is 88 years young and served 3 years, 10 days, 1 hour, and 10 minutes in the United States Navy during World War II. He flew 35 missions in Air Group 15 on an SB-2C Helldiver as both a rear gunner and photographer. I had the pleasure of escorting Poppy last fall on an honor flight trip to visit the World War II Memorial, and he and I became friends. When the Natural Resources Committee scheduled a hearing on this legislation, I invited Poppy to come testify before the committee, and he graciously accepted the offer, and he came out to testify at his own personal expense. Here's a brief excerpt of Poppy's testimony at the hearing, and I quote, "I feel with no doubt that it would be appropriate that this prayer be inscribed in some manner at the World War II Memorial. Those reading this prayer will be able to recall the sacrifices made by our military, also those on the home front. This prayer came at a perilous time, yet it was answered in victory at a dear cost of lives. Today, this prayer can pertain to any military action. Under present circumstances, it is also appropriate." Now, I don't think anybody or anyone in this body could be more succinct and articulate than Mr. Fowler. And I thank him again for coming to Washington to testify on behalf of this legislation and for being here for today's debate and final vote in the House. Before I close, I also want to thank my fellow Ohioan, Chris Long, for his tireless efforts to gain support and momentum for this legislation. This legislation wouldn't be on the House floor today without Chris's efforts. Like Poppy, I have no doubt that the prayer should be included among the tributes to the greatest generation memorialized on the National Mall. And I strongly urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 2070 would direct the Secretary of Interior to install at the World War II Memorial a plaque or inscription with the text of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's prayer on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The committee considered the legislation in November. We have no objections, and I have one more speaker, so I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask if the minority bill manager has additional speakers on this bill?
Yes, I do, Mr. Speaker. I have one speaker.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, as much time as he may consume.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, is recognized.
I want to thank my friend Mr. Sablan and the members for pursuing this important legislation. I rise on behalf of not just myself, but of a now departed World War II combat veteran by the name of Frank J. Kucinich, Sr. He was proud to serve this country. He served in the Pacific Theater, but all veterans come together in paying respect not only to those who served, but to a president who on June 6, 1944, as the nation was preparing for that D-Day invasion, said the following, quote, "With thy blessing we shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemy. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. Lead us to the saving of our country, and with our sister nations into a world unity that will spell a sure peace, a peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men, and a peace that will let all of men live in freedom, reaping the just rewards of their honest toil. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen." Those words by President Franklin Roosevelt upon the occasion of D-Day, June 6, 1944, should not only be inscribed, as my friend in his work will make sure of it with the consent of this Congress, on a plaque for a suitable presence in the memorial, but should also be reflected upon on a daily basis to remind us of the sacrifices that people have made for this country, and to remind us that the ultimate objective of those sacrifices is peace. Peace within our nation and peace among people around the world. And so it was in that spirit of human unity and in recognition of the importance of this legislation that I ask all of our colleagues to join with us in approving it. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Ohio yields back. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleagues for their support. May I ask if the Minority Bill Manager has any additional speakers? We do not.
No, I don't, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands yields back his time.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Both sides having yielded back their time, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2070 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker, on that, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 290.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 101, H.R. 290, a bill to amend Title 36, United States Code, to ensure that memorials commemorating the service of the United States Armed Forces may contain religious symbols and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, and the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Simon, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 290, introduced by the gentleman from California, Mr. Hunter, will allow the inclusion of religious symbols as part of military monuments. In 1913, a memorial that included a 43-foot-tall cross was placed on Mount Soledad in San Diego, California, as a tribute to the members of the armed forces who sacrificed their lives to defend the United States. In 1989, the city of San Diego was sued over the cross, with critics claiming it violated the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and to the California Constitution. Several remedies were attempted over the years to avoid the cross being removed by the courts. These included transferring the property to a nonprofit organization, but this too led to a lawsuit. The property was also declared a national memorial by Congress in 2004. In 2006, Congress enacted Public Law 109-272 to transfer the memorial to the Department of Defense. The federal government was sued, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the cross was unconstitutional. While the legislation does not specifically resolve the constitutionality of the Mount Soledad cross, this legislation will, for the first time, statutorily protect religious symbols in all war memorials and make clear Congress's intent in the U.S. Code. I urge adoption of H.R. 290 and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablon, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized. As much time as he wishes to consume.
And I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 290 is a bill that would allow religious symbols to be included as part of memorials commemorating the service of the United States Armed Services. The legislation, sponsored by my good friend, Congressman Hunter of California, was considered by the Committee on Natural Resources in July. I commend my colleague, Mr. Hunter, for moving this legislation forward. We have no objections to the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
I was recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Hunter, the author of the bill.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank the gentleman from Ohio and the gentleman from the Northern Marianas Islands, and for the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for his service as a veteran and what he's done for this country. One of the most common ways that this nation honors its military and war dead is with monuments and memorials. Across the nation, from Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego to Arlington National Cemetery, there are countless markers paying tribute to America's war heroes and the brave men and women who never came home. In many cases, these markers display symbols of religion and personal faith, representing not just individuals, but the shared commitment and sacrifice of those who serve and those who made the ultimate sacrifice to protect others and us here at home. I'm reminded of headstones at Arlington National Cemetery or images of Normandy, where symbols of personal faith and religion are prominently displayed. And even these symbols never overshadow the purpose and message of honoring our military and veterans. Now this time-honored tradition is under attack. Civil liberty groups have taken offense to the presence of religious symbols on war memorials. They're going after a cross sitting atop a hill at Camp Pendleton in San Diego. It's not an official site sanctioned by the Marine Corps or the federal government, and the cross can't even be seen by the public. But groups are pushing the Marine Corps to remove the cross from Camp Pendleton, even when the base is contributing much of their manpower to the fight in Afghanistan and, more recently, Iraq. The Mount Soledad Veterans Memorial in San Diego is also a cause for their outrage. The memorial, first erected to honor veterans of the Korean War, displaying a 29-foot concrete cross, is now under the full ownership of the Department of Defense. At the base of the cross are more than 3,000 plaques with images and statements paying tribute to the veterans of all wars and religions. Last year, the runaway Ninth Circuit Court ruled that the memorial is unconstitutional, overturning a lower court ruling. The future of the Mount Soledad Veterans Memorial is uncertain, even though the memorial, for all its years as a fixture of the San Diego community, has one stated purpose: to remember those who have fought and died for this nation. H.R. 290 ensures Mount Soledad and any other war memorial will withstand these attacks by allowing the inclusion of all symbols of religion and personal faith on war memorials, established and under the control of the federal government. For the 131 national cemeteries under the purview of the Department of Veterans Affairs, there are currently 48 emblems of belief authorized. There is no preference for one symbol over another, the way that things should be. In the face of persistent legal challenges and the threat of more to come, it's important that we install the right protection for war memorials in federal law, allowing the spirit and tradition of honoring our nation's military to continue. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, some members may be aware of specific situations regarding religious symbols located on public land in California. In fact, the committee report for H.R. 290 in fact mentions one of these ongoing controversies. It is important to note that the committee report also makes clear that this legislation does not specifically address the Mount Soledad situation. Further, the report includes analysis of the legislation by the Congressional Budget Office, which found that, under current law, religious symbols are not barred from being used in any military memorials. Thus, H.R. 290 would codify current practice. According to the Department of Defense, the National Park Service, and the American Battle Monuments Commission, implementing H.R. 290 would not require any new memorials to be built or current memorials to be changed. H.R. 290 is not necessary and does not appear to change current law. As a result, we do not oppose it. And at this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to inquire of Mr. Johnson if he has any additional speakers.
Yes, we have one additional speaker, Mr. Speaker.
At this time, I reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Bill Bray.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I am truly honored and proud to be here today as a co-sponsor of this bill. This is a bill that will protect and defend religious symbols on war memorials from Washington to San Diego. I think that we need to remember that one thing that was a foundation of this country was religious tolerance. And this bill is addressing the fact that there are those who refuse to express religious tolerance and are actually out after any symbol, no matter how traditionally accepted and how universally accepted by the community, as a general recognition of service and devotion and memorial, that they would attack it if they could find a religious connotation in any form. Remind you, our Constitution protects the freedom of religion, not freedom from it. But I think that this issue is one that has gone so far that we're actually talking about tearing crosses down over war memorials, and I don't think any American across the board who really believes in tolerance would support that. I'm very honored to have 4 plaques at this memorial at San Diego. Frankly, I have a father, a stepfather, a brother, and a stepbrother whose plaques are at the memorial at Mount Soledad. This is a family effort. I remember as a child my father pointing up at the cross up at Mount Soledad and that memorial that it symbolized and said it was one of the few in the country to the men and women who died in Korea. Now, I also was very privileged in 2006 to be the co-sponsor of a bill with another Duncan Hunter, Duncan's father, that specifically had Congress and the federal government come in to save this war memorial. Mr. Speaker, if you're not going to support this bill, if your attitude is that any religious connotation anywhere in the world that is on federal controlled property needs to be torn down and destroyed, then you can take that position. But don't stand in these chambers and point at religious symbols over in Europe or in San Diego and say they must come down or you will not defend them. If you're going to sit in these chambers with Moses at one side, Pope Innocent and Pope Gregory on the other, and Calvin in this chambers, if you're not going to stand up and demand that this Congress tear those plaques off these walls, then for God's sakes, leave the memorials at our war memorials alone and don't tear down religious symbols just because you're intolerant and can't stand the fact that there are some of us that respect our war service and respect their faith, but most importantly, respect the heritage that has made America what it is today. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask if the Minority Bill Manager has any additional speakers? We do not.
Mr. Speaker, I do not, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands yields back his time. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Both sides having yielded back their time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 290? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended and the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1022.
The clerk will report the title.
Union Calendar Number 110, H.R. 1022, a bill to authorize the Secretary of the Interior to conduct a study of alternatives for commemorating and interpreting the role of the Buffalo Soldiers in the early years of the national parks and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, and the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablon, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1022 authorizes the National Park Service to study alternatives for commemorating and interpreting the role of the Buffalo Soldiers in the early years of the national parks. The Buffalo Soldiers were a segregated Army unit composed of African-American cavalrymen. For nearly 25 years before the creation of the National Park Service, Yosemite National Park was administered by the U.S. Army. The Buffalo Soldiers played a key role protecting those park resources that have since been enjoyed by millions of Americans. Their success will be examined by this study that will focus on existing resources inside current national parks. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves his time. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he wishes to consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 1022 would direct the Secretary of Interior to study ways the National Park Service could commemorate the role of Buffalo soldiers. Buffalo soldiers were African-American troops who served in the first national parks, including Yosemite and Sequoia National Park, prior to the establishment of the National Park Service. The legislation, sponsored by Congresswoman Spear of California, was considered by the Committee on Natural Resources in May. I commend my colleague, Congresswoman Spear, for introducing this legislation and her leadership on this issue, and we strongly support this legislation.